we fixed one and put it up. The boxes, there were a pair right there. It was quite interesting to watch. There were two of us, and the box, the pairs would immediately occupy a box once we got it back up on the post. Quite fun to watch. So today, tonight, I'm going to tell you about more about the tree swallows out there and their long history, and you can see the title. I also wanted to thank at the start here the Edmonton Oiler Foundation for not starting their hockey game tonight until 8 o'clock when I'll be finished. So I appreciate them waiting to start this game an extra hour before while we're busy here. Otherwise, I know that Gerald wouldn't be on the call. So this story starts obviously when I was born. So on the right, you can see me being held by my granddad and my mom and my grandma. And this was in Yorkshire, England. And my grandfather was a coal miner. And coal miners, as you probably know, use canaries to warn them about methane concentrations down in the coal mine. And if the canary keeled over, they're more susceptible to methane than humans are. The miners knew to get the heck out of the coal mine and escape before there's a chance of an explosion. And interestingly, I don't know if my grandfather had one of these or not. I never saw this, but I was pretty little. And so this is a cage holding a canary with an air bottle, compressed air. So if the canary keeled over, they would turn on the air to revive the canary and then hurry out of the mine. The canaries were relatively expensive compared to the salaries they made, so they didn't want to lose their bird and have to buy a new one. The other side note there is virtually always only female canaries were used because the male canaries were in demand for the pet trade for singing birds in people's houses. So the miners typically would use a female canary. However, after thinking about it, my grandfather died in his 50s of what at the time we were called black lung. So beyond the canary being a warning in the coal mine, my grandfather actually became a canary in the coal mine, warning us about lung health. And a lot of our warnings now, we think of how the precautions we take around dust and other problems where we're breathing. My grandfather would go into a coal mine with no protection at all. So he was really a canary in a coal mine without realizing it at the time. My second instance of personally working with the theme of canaries in a coal mine was Peregrine Falcons. They were a canary in a coal mine warning us about DDT. And Rachel Carson wrote a silent book called Silent Spring and warned us about pesticides. It's still referenced today, and we've gotten rid of DDT for the most part, but there are other pesticides, as you'll see, that are now a cause for concern as they're affecting other birds, and particularly swallows. So DDT bioaccumulated through the food chain. That means it's fairly stable and would be absorbed by the plants, eaten by insects, eaten by small birds, and then eaten by peregrine falcons. So the concentrations increased about tenfold in each level of the food chain. And so it's called biomagnification. I couldn't find an illustration of biomagnification for a peregrine, but it's the same here with an eagle and fish-eating birds. It was the same with terrestrial birds. So DDT concentrated. And the result was that the birds, the females, it interfered with the female's ability to lay calcium and while egg laying. So the eggs were laid with very thin layers of calcium. The shells would break just from the weight of the bird, which they shouldn't do normally. And production of young peregrines went to zero over most of southern North America. And of course, even the ones in the Arctic had residual DDT from feeding in the south. So their productivity was lower, although not reduced to zero. So as a result of that, in 1970, there was only one pair of peregrine falcons nesting south of the tree line and east of the Rockies in Canada, and likewise in eastern North America, eastern US. And I've mentioned the interference of DDT and deposition of calcium. So I did become involved in this program after Richard Fife, Phil Treffry, and others had started it at Wainwright. I don't know how many of you had a chance to visit there in the 1980s and early 90s. It was open sort of indirectly to the public. And we bred captive peregrine. We took peregrine falcons from the wild, just the Adam peregrines. They bred naturally in the large pens that were there, and we released the young back into the wild. So I became involved in 1985, and I'd like to show this chart. I was just checking to see, sometimes I have a circle. So Richard Fife started the program, figured out all the techniques. I became a manager in 1985, and I like to think that the change in the incline from 85 onwards was due to the changes that I made. We doubled the productivity of the facility. We produced 100 young a year. We changed the way they were being sent out into the wild, and the recovery program was much more rapid, and we were able to close Wainwright in 1996 with the peregrine recovered over most of Canada. And now, of course, I have a whole talk about peregrines. We can do that some other time. So, and it was down, it took the curious part, I finally got to retire, but the peregrines weren't downlisted until 2012, even though the recovery team had decided there was no longer need for captive breeding and release in 1996. And that was the bureaucracy just taking a long time to work through. So the current topic tonight are swallows. There's many species of swallows. I'm going to focus mostly on tree swallows, but there are lots of others, as you know, and some of them are coming back. I'm still waiting for the first purple martin to show up at our boxes, either at BBO or at my home here, but certainly the tree swallows are back. So my swallow story starts at Long Point Bird Observatory in 1961 when I was a young teenager and banded my first bird, became hooked on banding birds and studying birds, and decided at a fairly young age I was going to get a PhD and study birds all my life. And I like to joke that I'm still the teenager living his dream, now doing it mostly with studying birds at the Bird Observatory. So the Bird Observatory was established in 1984, and coincidentally, I moved to Edmonton in 84. Some of the banders invited me to come out and band out there, and it was sort of a weekend hobby banding. And I said, well, this is kind of fun, but why don't we pattern what we're doing after the Long Point Bird Observatory? I wrote Michael Bradstreet and got all the data sheets. We coordinated our banding and formed the Bird Observatory. And we built that first building on the bottom left and in the 1980s. And then in 2020, 2021, we built our new lab on the right. And if you haven't been out for 5 years, please come on out and admire our new building and our 80-foot communications tower with a Modus antennae on top. At the same time, because I'd studied swallows for my master's and PhD, I couldn't resist building boxes. So after that Easter weekend out at Beaverhill, I went home, built a bunch of boxes, set them out in the grassland where it says 50 boxes there. I don't think I set 50 up right away, but anyway, started setting up boxes, and I just saw an opportunity to recreate some of the things that I'd done at Long Point. And little did I know that I'd be here tonight talking about this long history of 40 years of monitoring swallow boxes there. So a paper in 2014 showed that the swallows at Beaverhill Lake have the largest clutches and the highest productivity of anywhere in North America. And I've put the graph there on the right. You can see the red circle. And so clutch size is at the y-axis on the vertical, and you can see that red dot is higher than any other circle. There are, we're in the study, in the paper review, there were tree swallow colonies further north, only a couple of the similar latitude in Saskatchewan, but none had as high a productivity. And that came from Peter Dunn's thesis out at Beaverhill, where he studied swallows for his PhD. So that's pretty special. And And the question is, has that continued? Oops, I did something here. There we go. However, since that time, clutch size has declined. It's declined from just over 6.5 eggs to 5.9. And I assume that that my brothers aren't on this call. A couple of them are engineers, and they want to know what 0.6 of an egg looks like. So I have to teach them about averages. Hopefully you all understand what I'm saying here. So anyway, there's been a decline of 10% of clutch size, the number of eggs laid. This study, last review was done in 2012, so it's a bit out of date, but you can see a very distinct decline. And obviously, if you have fewer eggs, you're going to get fewer young. So they've declined likewise, the number of young fledged. And then interesting, nest success has also declined. So that's a bit more concerning. Nest success means that there were nests that totally failed. So not just a reduction in the number of eggs and young, but actual failures increased. So the success rate has declined. And the number of attempts at Beaverhill Lake declined also. So we've got a lot of negative trends showing here in this tree swallows from 1984 to 2012. So not to be too discouraged, I'll show you an uphill graph. Curiously, the date of the first egg is later now than it was in 1984. So you can see in about 1984, the late date of the first egg was around May 24th, and that was June 1st by the end of this review. So quite a delay in laying. And the question, of course, is why? So we're going to go into a whodunit here. So here's the data we've got. Date of the first egg is later, clutch size is smaller, fewer young are fledging, fewer nest attempts, lower percent are successful, and the number of pairs have declined. So the question is why? And so we're going to do a whodunit. And so I do. So those of you that are Murdoch Mysteries fans, this is a case of getting William Murdoch on the case and looking at possible causes. So what is the role of climate change? Is there a decline driven by changes in spring temperatures causing the delay? Is there a decline in the drying of the lake? Are pollution and pesticides issues of concern? What about wintering areas? So we can look at all the possible causes, use William Murdoch's intuitive detective work, and try and figure out who done it. So let's analyze each of these individually and see what we find. So predictions of climate change is our first suspect. As our climate warms, tree swallows should nest earlier and have more eggs and more young. And obviously we're getting an opposite trend. But in fact, in Eastern North America, David Winkler and others found that over that 1959 to 1991, tree swallows were laying eggs earlier, 9 days earlier. They didn't have larger clutches, but they were laying earlier. You remember ours are laying later. So why the difference? Well, it turns out despite climate change, general pattern of having warmer global temperatures, there's a lot of seasonal information that's lost in that. And in central Alberta, our maize are cooler now than what they were in the 1980s. So if there are cooler years, then that could be easily a cause of why they're nesting later, because they're waiting for the insects to warm up. They get the variability from year to year there. You get more cooler years and therefore more delays in their nesting. And also, if we analyze at the time of nesting, late nests produce fewer young. So if birds are nesting late, then their productivity declines. And the colder maize are causing them to lay later. And likewise, clutch size is affected by temperature. So warmer maize, they lay more eggs. Cooler maize, they lay fewer eggs. And so if there are more cooler maize, then their clutch size is going to decline over time. And likewise, constantly fewer young are produced in cooler maize. So temperature is definitely a possible problem. The other thing related to climate change are extreme weather effects, events. So for example, in 2021, There was a heavy snowfall with sub-zero temperatures on May 19th. And then the opposite extreme heat. You remember the heat wave in around the July long weekend, extreme temperatures. Both of these are problematic for birds. Cold temperatures, obviously the birds need insects, and insects aren't flying below zero. And so they're a problem getting food and having enough food to lay enough eggs. And then with extreme heat, the young can actually cook in the nest. And we had examples of what we believe a whole broods who were just dead in the nest from the extreme heat. So these also can cause declines in swallow populations. And this is just a reflection of the same thing. So you look at the fledging success on the right in 2019, 2020, where we didn't have a heat wave, fledged success was quite high, 90%. And then 2021 with that heat wave, fledging success rate was only 60%. So an added 30% of the young died because of the extreme heat that year. So certainly climate change is a suspect in our search for what's causing these declines. The drying of Beaverhill Lake was also an issue. So by 2000, the early 2000s, the lake was shrinking and dried out. It was originally 140 square kilometers, but only 1 or 2 meters deep. So basically just a giant prairie slough with not a lot of depth to it. And it remained dry until around 2016, when we had summer rains and more runoff from snowfalls in the spring. So why is this important? Well, I flip back to my master's and PhD, where I determined at Long Point, 91% of the swallow's diet were midges, and midges come out of wetlands. The aquatic larvae live in wetlands, and then the adults, which is what the swallows get, are just the breeding form. So the adult midges come up, great swarms, and the swallows feed on those, and that's their primary food. And you can see in the graph here from my thesis, the quantity available in the traps that I was using when it approached 10 milligrams of midges per cubic meter, then the rate of midge intake by the swallows was virtually 100% of their diet. So they, when they were available, that's all they ate. So when the lake dries up, then there's a problem with the midges not having any water. They're simply not there. So the swallows are then dependent on less optimal food to forage. There's also the issue of timing. This graph on the left shows the synchronization between the midges appearing and the swallows wanting food. And if there's a time shift, then there isn't the food supply for the eggs to be laid. So the drying of, why is Beaverhill Lake drying? Well, there are 2 reasons as far as I can see. One is there's a lack of severe summer storms. So in 2016, there was a summer storm that caused flooding in Edmonton. The white mud was flooded and cars were drowned in some of the underpasses. That storm moved east to the south of Beaverhill Lake over Amos Creek and sat there for a couple of days, raining and raining and raining. And the Amos Creek looked like a kayak river, looked like a mountain river flowing into Beaverhill, flooding the lake. The other issue is the lack of spring runoff. So this year, you'll remember, we had pretty reasonable snowfall. We had those big 2 snowfalls just a couple of weeks ago, and all of that snow melted and ran straight into the ground. There was very little runoff on the creeks that I saw. And the reason is in the fall, our autumn was very dry, and that results in porous soil when it freezes. It's like a sponge, and then when the snow melts, the water simply runs off straight into the ground. It doesn't fill up our creeks. So the lake is coming back. Here's an example of what happened to it. So I showed you the slide on the left, 1985. You can see where the boxes were. So the sign of 50 boxes in the same place on the picture on the right in 2013. the forest is grown in. With the drying of the lake, the water table drops, and the aspen trees and willow trees have moved in, almost burying the bird observatory in the forest. We did see some refilling, as I mentioned, 2016 to 2019. Here's a couple of different photos of water into the lake. One taken by a friend flying to Toronto and happened to be on the right side of the lake. So you can see the lake in 2017, not full by any means, but certainly area-wise about half of what it used to be. Not half the volume of water, but half the area. And then we had runoff. I can't see the top on here. 20. I can't. The Zoom information blocks the top of my slide. So a lot of runoff in some of the years since 2016, but certainly not every year by any means. So I mentioned that clutch size had declined. That's the same graph. What I've added here is the productivity, the number of eggs in the blue dot here in 2021 to 2023. So in fact, the refilling of the lake has had an impact on productivity those 3 years, or at least clutch size was back up where it was in the 1980s. So now we've got an aha moment, simply filling the lake up, providing the swallows with more midges, more food supply has actually increased productivity. So, but how are swallows doing elsewhere? Well, we can look at the breeding bird surveys in North America. These are surveys done mostly by volunteers along roadsides. You start half an hour before dawn, drive every half a mile because it was set up in the US, and listen for 3 minutes, do 50 stops. So it's a standardized survey, and you can see that the swallows here have been declining across Canada at 2% per year. So the decline we saw at Beaverhill is not unusual. That's exactly what was happening elsewhere. However, if we break it down more geographically, in Alberta, there's actually was an increase over the same time frame. And you remember at Beaverhill, it was declining. If we look at where they were, where swallows are most abundant and their populations changing, this graph here shows in blue areas where swallows are increasing, and in red where they're decreasing. So one of the problems with talking about a Canadian average decline is that it obscures the increases in the prairies. So obviously the blue there in Alberta, they've been increasing in Alberta, whereas they've been declining in BC and Manitoba East. So that's what I always caution students to beware of averages, because you need to look at what information you've put into those averages. I'm going to skip through that one. And as well as where their trends are, you also, from the breeding bird survey, can find out where are they most abundant. And what's interesting here is you see this central Alberta, where my pointer is, the deep dark red. So tree swallows are more abundant in central Alberta than they are across North America. So they're virtually at the highest level of abundance that they occur anywhere. So we're actually in quite a special area for tree swallows, and maybe the tree swallows know that because they know they're going to get high productivity if they come to central Alberta. There are, of course, other areas, the wetlands of southern Manitoba and into the Dakotas are also important for swallows. How are other species doing? Well, you may have seen this graph. I've certainly shown it many times, where from 1970 to 2020, there's been a 1/3 decline in the abundance of birds in North America. We've lost 2.9 billion birds in 50 years. Again, this is an average figure, and it doesn't mean that every species has declined that way, but it's certainly a cause for concern. Waterfowl have rebounded, but a big chunk of the waterfowl increase are snow geese. If you look at the individual species, birds, a lot of our dabbling ducks, mallards are pretty constant over that time period, but some, like snow geese, have increased dramatically, and we can talk about why in a different slide talk. Raptors have increased. Well, that's partly because they've shown you the recovery of peregrine falcons and other raptors increasing due to the declines from DDT prior to 1970, and then their recovery during this time period that the authors were talking about. And as for the increase in the abundance of turkeys, I worked for the federal government for 36 years. And when I retired, I can tell you there were a lot more turkeys active in government than when I started. So I'll leave it there. If we break it out into other species groups, the bad news is down at the bottom here. Shorebirds have declined 40%, grassland birds 57%, and aerial insectivores, which includes the swallows and flycatchers, 59%. So there have been dramatic declines in those three categories of birds, despite the good news above. And likewise, this is similar data, but looking at it for forest types. So the eastern forest isn't doing too badly, whereas over on the right, you can see the aerial insectivores and the grassland birds have declined quite dramatically. The decline was the subject of a paper by Silke Niebel in 2010, looking at the declines and determining if there's any geographic pattern. So this relates to the map I showed you earlier, where although there's been a decline, it isn't everywhere. And so she used the breeding bird surveys, I've already told you about those, and analyzed them and determined that aerial insectivores were in fact declining more than any other group of birds. And the decline was most strong east of 100th meridian and north of 35 degrees. So if you remember the map I showed you, that's a red area from Manitoba across eastern Canada. So that's where the decline was most severe, and she simply quantified that map and proved the information. So there you go. I didn't realize I'd forgotten I have the map back in there. So that's where she determined that declines were most severe for the swallows in general, not just the tree swallows, which is what this map is from. We can look at barn swallows. Red is a decline, and you can see the barn swallows are actually have a lot more red on the map than the tree swallows did. And the only blue, the only increases are in the southern US states, where they have in fact been increasing. Won't have time to do kingbirds. So her conclusions are that the aerial insectivores are declining faster than any other passerines, the geographic variation I've mentioned, and the decline started in the mid-1980s. So we've now got a time frame. So when did these declines start? In the mid-1980s. And it's also when she looked at the pattern of where birds winter, it was more acute for long distance migrants, those that overwinter in South America. So then that raises the question of where do our swallows overwinter? Oh, I guess I'm coming to that soon. Sorry, I thought that was next. So let's have a look at the role of pesticides and what might be happening there. So neonicotinoids, there's a lot of publicity in the last few years about neonicotinoids and bees, and beekeepers complaining that agricultural insecticides, specifically neonicotinoids, were killing their bees. Well, obviously bees are insects, and the alarm bells went off among all the aerial insectivore researchers that neonics are killing all insects, not just bees. So they're sprayed on seeds, they're covered on seeds before they're planted. So when a farmer buys the seed, it's already got neonics on it. And that is to try and prevent the insects from eating the seeds, the terrestrial insects. It's used as a seed coating. It's now banned in Europe. I have to update this slide, but it was especially put on canola and corn. And clearly a potential problem for tree swallows that are eating aerial insecticides. The hero in this story is Christy, oops, sorry, I got hiccups there. Christy Morrissey at the University of Saskatchewan. And she's done extensive research on neonicotinoids and discovered that the neonicotinoids are fairly stable. They stay in the soil. And then when the snow melts, the runoff, when there is runoff, takes the neonics into the wetlands. And the wetlands have the highest concentrations of neonicotinoids in the spring before the farmers are planting the crop. So I've shown it here. The neonics remain in the ground in the spring, are washed into wetlands, and they're still active, and it kills midges. So it's killing the food of swallows, even though it's not put on the wetland directly. As a side story, she did the research on neonicotinoids and white-crowned sparrow. She did this in Ontario, where there's a high density of Motus towers that will track the birds. And what she found is that if she gave the birds 4 to 8 seeds, which had neonicotinoids on them, the birds lost weight and delayed their migration up to a week. So she just did a very minor treatment. So you can imagine birds in a field eating a lot of seeds that can have devastating effect on not just swallows, but on birds directly that are feeding in these fields as they migrate north. And as many of you know, I worked on burrowing owls for many years. I thought, well, at least on the prairies we're safe from, and the native prairies we're safe from neonicotinoids and all the insecticides. Turns out I was naive. Reading Wes Olson's book about bison, I learned about ivermectin, dorvermectin, and those chemicals are put on cattle to prevent internal and external parasites from affecting them. And those chemicals are active for 6 months after the livestock are treated, cows and horses. It's actually similar to what one puts on your dog for keep ticks off them. And so it's active for 4 to 6 months. And that means that when the cattle lay a cow pie, the ivermectin, dorvermectin is still active in the cow pie, and insects do not eat the cow pie. So it's a researcher, Kevin Foote, with Ag Canada in Lethbridge, and he has shown that cow pies are basically inert. They're not food for insects the way they used to be because of the cattle treatment. So it turns out my naive assumption that the prairies were still fine isn't the case. If there's cattle on the prairie, then the insect abundance has declined because their cow pies are not available to be eaten by the insects. And if we look at Beaverhill Lake, a lot of the water comes from Amos Creek to the south, and that includes a mixture of both cropland and cattle pastures. So it's quite likely that Amos Creek and Beaverhill Lake are getting doses of neonicotinoids and maybe ivermectin too, but we have no data on the pesticide levels in the water itself. Something I'd like to see done, but I haven't managed to find a researcher interested in taking up the cause. Of related interest, and again, a bit of a side story, but it relates to our bigger story, is Natalia did a study with Colleen Cassidy St. Clair at the University of Alberta, looking at colors of the iridescence of swallows. And the study was set out to look at comparing the swallow color in the pristine area of Beaverhill Lake compared to the polluted ponds in the city, and assuming that there was more pollution in the waters in the city than was in the lake. But what she found was the opposite, that in fact the heavy metal pollution, particularly zinc and copper, was higher in Beaverhill Lake than it was in the city wetlands. So this was a total surprise, and it did negatively affect the color and the color hue and chroma brightness of the feathers in the Beaverhill. Sorry, that should say in Beaverhill's tree swallows. So that's a further indication that maybe something's happening with the water running into Beaverhill. If it's got higher levels of heavy metals, what else is in that water that's running in, and how is it affecting the birds there? So another question that I posed at the start is, where do they go for the winter? Is there an issue there? Well, we tracked tree swallows using geolocators. Geolocators are little devices that sit on the back of the bird. We attach 70 of them, retrieve 24. Geolocators are quite ingenious little devices. They're very light, and they record light level and time. And one might think, well, how does that help? Well, if you know time and light level, you can determine dawn and dusk. And if you know time and dawn, you can determine your longitude around the planet. And if you know date and day length, except for the equinoxes, you can determine your latitude. So it's not a dead accurate system. It's plus or minus 100 kilometers or so, but you can actually geolocate where a swallow was in the year from putting the tag on to retrieving it. you have to retrieve them. They don't transmit information. So if we have to go out the following years and watch with telescopes, determine where the birds were, and then cut the nanotags off. And here's what we found. It was a very cool study coordinated by Ryan Norris, the University of Guelph, and he got a dozen tree swallow researchers to collaborate from Alaska to Nova Scotia. So all the red dots are the breeding colonies where they were marked. Beaverhill's number 2. I don't know why we weren't number 1, but anyway, we're striving to be number 1. So Beaverhill's number 2, and the yellow areas are where the birds flew after breeding and stayed typically for a couple of months to molt. So these are staging areas, stopovers, and then the purple or bluey purple are where they overwintered. So he was able to look at the geographic pattern of all the breeding areas where they had their molting areas and then where they overwintered. And this is the general pattern that he found. You can see Beaverhill Lake here. And the birds generally went east. They staged and molted in Manitoba, the Dakotas, down a bit further south. And they stayed there for two months. So they left Beaverhill in early July. Within a week of fledging their young, they were in southern Manitoba or the Dakotas, stayed there for 2 months, and then in September, October, went down the Mississippi. Beaverhill, one of the birds from Beaverhill was the most southerly one in Central America here. Some of them wintered in Florida and Georgia. Some of the Beaverhill ones wintered around the Gulf Coast. So there wasn't a single wintering area to explain the decline of tree swallows nesting at Beaverhill Lake or anywhere else. They all mixed up in the winter. There was no pattern of a specific breeding area going to a specific wintering area. So there's, and there specifically is the pattern from Beaverhill. So that you can see the big green and little green dots are where they molted, and then the wintering areas are where they went. So they went to many different areas, and then they did rush back in the spring. So the fall migration was a couple of months of molting and then moving, whereas in the spring they came back very rapidly. And as I mentioned, a lot of them got back here out to Beaverhill today, and I assume more will arrive over the weekend. Another interesting side note, although we think of swallows as always eating plants, or sorry, insects. I'm getting tired. Eating insects. In the winter, in Georgia and Florida, they actually eat bayberry berries. So it's indigestible for most birds, but for some reason, yellow-rumped warblers and tree swallows will land on these shrubs and eat the berries. I've never seen that myself. I'd be curious to see swallows as berry eaters, not something we associate with them. The study also resulted in a very cool pattern of the life cycle of the birds. You can start over here in March. So basically all of the populations leave the wintering areas in the middle of March. It takes the outer circle or the Alaska birds. It takes them longer to get to their breeding area. So their time from arrival in Alaska to breeding is much shorter than the southern populations that arrive more quickly to their breeding areas and then spend more time before they actually start egg laying. And then you can see the pattern here where the breeding departures, oops, where's my cursor, in July, and then the migration, the long period of molting, and then arrival in the wintering areas. So the Alaska birds, even though they've got further to travel, end up arriving in the wintering areas faster than some of the more southerly populations. So it's a cool study, and can't cover it all just in a brief mention I make of it here. So one of the things that I found very curious, and this first primed my interest in 2014, this picture of tree swallows was posted on social media at the end of April, so even earlier than now. And thousands of swallows in the trees around Calgary. And when I looked at the maps on the Great Plains, there were no swallows present. So fortunately, eBird has produced this graphic showing the migration of tree swallows across North America, and I'm going to let it click through here and then we'll watch it once more. So you can see the birds moving. They're on their breeding range now. The date is shown there, June 20th, 27th, July 4th. So here's where they're breeding. Now into August is where they're doing their staging. So they've retreated from the Great Plains. And now they started going down the Mississippi, and they see a population over in California moving there. So I'm not sure if I can easily, yeah, okay. So here's where they are in the winter. Okay, so we'll start, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Can I start it again? Okay, so here it's going down. Now, as it comes north, it happens fairly quickly, and it looks like I won't be able to stop it easily. As they come back north, watch how quickly they come up the west coast and into BC, but the birds take a lot longer to get up and around the Great Lakes. So here in April, here they are in Alberta, coming across from BC, and then boom, early May, they spread from the Florida Caribbean population into Alberta. So Alberta is actually a mixing ground of these two populations of tree swallows, the ones that winter in California and northern Mexico, and the ones that winter around, and I'll call it the Gulf of Mexico on purpose, that winter around the Gulf of Mexico. So that's a curious, something we didn't know before. And of course, that raises lots of questions. If do pairs stay segregated in the breeding grounds, or do we have birds from California and from the Gulf Coast interbreeding? And if that happens, which way do the young go? So lots of interesting questions. Are there in fact two different color morphs that we're not identifying of tree swallows, like there are of flickers and juncos, where there's eastern and western forms? There's clearly an eastern and western population of tree swallows. What does that should tell us about tree swallows that we have missed all these years? And so this is a graph from 2018. You can see on April 8th, the tree swallows are into southern BC, but they're nowhere near Alberta coming from the east. So in the conclusion then, we have all these concerns, many populations, many tree swallows nest successfully at Beaverhill, but a lot of their parameters are negative, and they're also declining across North America, regardless of where they overwinter. So if we go through our chart there, you remember those of you that are Murdoch Mystery fans, you'll have a chart. So we're making up a chart here. So what are the potential causes? Well, climate change is creating colder springs, especially in May. It had a role in drying the lake, and hopefully will have a role in flushing the lake back hill, refilling it. But we're still getting weather extremes, the extreme severe weather, whether it's spring or summer, cold weather or a heat dome are both negative. We can also leave as a suspect neonicotinoids and ivermectins, the pesticides on insects, and they're put on grains and are put on cattle. We have very little information about the staging areas. So we really don't know what happens when the swallows are concentrated at a few sites when they're molting in September and October. And winter, I suggest, is less of a concern because they're dispersed over a large area. So it seems less likely that there's a big factor affecting them in the winter, but we just don't have a lot of information. So I think the two big candidates are climate change and pesticides, and maybe even an interaction between the two. Some good news, and I inserted this when I gave a talk, this talk last fall. The United Kingdom declared on October 1st last year that it was finally closing its last coal power generating station had shut down after 142 years. So some progress, at least in the UK. And as you know, in Alberta, we're converting to natural gas rather than coal, trying to reduce our climate impact of producing electricity. On a side note, it was mentioned, Karen mentioned this, the Snow Goose Festival is coming up this weekend. I encourage you all to come out. It's a great thing to experience, to see the geese. There are buses leaving from the Tofield curling rink every half hour. Gerald Romanchuk and others We'll be out scouting out where the geese are. So when the bus leaves, it's got a beeline to find out where the flocks are, and they move around quite a lot. So it's advantageous to be on the bus and not head out on your own. I met a car full of people out there today wanting to know where the geese were. And I said, you know, this isn't TV, this is real life, and you have to drive around and find them. So Gerald and others will be scouting that for you. There'll be lots of trade displays, trade shows, nature displays in the curling rink. The bird observatory will have some of its bird ambassadors there. I think we're going to have, better not say, I think it's a burrowing owl and a prairie falcon, but that could have changed over the next day or two. And then the banquet Saturday night. And if you are a keen birder and don't want to bother with going, paying for a bus, then consider signing up as a guide on a bus. I think most of our buses have guides. Maybe the odd one needs an assistant, but you can participate that way too. So anyway, I encourage you to come out and participate. snowgoosefestival.com, pretty easy to remember, and you can get tickets there for the buses. If you're in Sherwood Park or don't want to drive all the way out there, Sherwood, Strathcona County are providing free shuttle buses from the Bethel bus depot out to the curling rink pretty frequently through the 2 days and then back again. And then you can transfer there to the tour buses looking for geese. So with that, thank you for your interest. And if there are any questions, and hopefully we have a bit of time. How are we doing versus you? There's 4 minutes before the TV coverage. Anyway, I'm not sure when the puck will drop for those of you that are hockey fanatics. So thank you very much. And I'll stop my screen share and answer any questions that have come up.
So that was great, Geoff. That was really good. It was very interesting in seeing those stats over the years and what's happening and some of the possibilities that might be influencing the birds. That's always interesting to see, especially in this day and age of many changes that we've seen.
Sure.
So thanks everybody for coming. We do have a lot of events coming up in the calendar, so do look at that. And do send me any suggestions for speakers, or if you'd like to do that, please send it on to me as well. And we'll just look at what comments we've got in the chat box. So comment, this has been fascinating. Thanks so much for the presentation. Another thanks. Oh, I think mine stopped. You can't move it.
That's all I've got too. So I answered everyone's questions. So that's awesome. But if you have a question, unmute yourself. Yeah, go ahead, Jan.
So compared to other insectivores, the tree swallows, unlike most flycatchers and other swallows, are cavity nesters. How much do you think the availability of nest boxes affects the numbers you see?
That's a very good question, and one that I hadn't brought up because it just complicates the story. So the breeding bird surveys are done along roadsides, and they're detecting the decline in tree swallows. And nest boxes are typically put up on fence posts along roads. So if people are putting up fewer boxes, then the observers will detect a decline, and that's a function of how many boxes are on the posts. So the only thing I can counter to that is at Beaverhill, the number of boxes have been fairly consistent for the last 40 years. So the decline was real, and then the increase with the recovery of the lake. But that certainly is a potential problem with the breeding bird survey, and specifically tree swallows where they're in nest boxes. It could become a problem here, not to be too much of a worrier, but raccoons are very hard on nest boxes on fence posts, and I've had friends from Ontario come out and been amazed at the number of boxes that are on our fence posts up and down the countryside. In Ontario, they can't do that anymore. Their raccoons just simply go from box to box, tearing them apart and emptying them. So that could be a problem in the future.
Thanks.
Okay, we've got, have there been any initiatives to reduce pesticides in Canada?
It's very controversial. There have been reviews by the Pesticide Management Agency. I'm not totally up to date on them, but the reviews always seem to, despite the evidence, result in pesticides being continued. So there'll be what I consider minor restrictions put on them. But as I mentioned, my understanding is neonicotinoids are now being banned in Europe because of their impact, but they're still allowed here. So the use is not as widespread, but it's still very prevalent, very common.
Another question was if ivermectin may also have a direct impact on birds like the neonic pesticides, or does it only affect the insects?
And as far as I know, it only affects the insects. So the ivermectin, dorvermectin is put on the cattle. So just if you have a dog and you buy the little package of liquid to put on their back, that soaks into their skin and prevents ticks and others from getting on them. That's the same with cattle. So it doesn't directly affect the cattle. The direct impact is on the dung of the cattle, and it's still poisonous to the insects. So normally, if you're familiar with dung beetles, they would grab a fresh cow pie, break it into little 1 centimeter balls, and roll it away and bury it, lay eggs in it, and basically sequester the cow pie underground, putting the carbon underground. They don't do that. A treated cow pie is simply inert. Kevin Foote's research in Lethbridge has shown that the only way cow pies disappear on the prairies now is a mechanical freeze-thaw cycle over several years. So he's actually worked out how many hectares of land are lost through cow pies not deteriorating, simply sitting inert on the prairies.
Another comment was, I've noted a huge increase in bank, barn, and cliff swallows at the Quesnel Bridge in the last 3 years. Only 1 pair of tree in 10 years at White Mud North. Yeah,
I can't explain the bank, barn, and cliff. Well, the bank must be on a bank nearby because they burrow into the clays on the side or the sand. That's good news if there's more barn and cliff swallows building their nests on the Quesnel Bridge. And I'm glad that one's over water so we don't get any enthusiastic maintenance people trying to spray them off. I had a pretty severe interaction with some of the park staff in Kootenay National Park when I discovered them with a water hose blasting the nests off the underside of the bridge. And we had a meeting with the superintendent, and that practice was put to an end pretty quick. So hopefully they leave the birds' nests. They are reused from year to year. The bank swallow one is certainly interesting. They're a listed species under SARA, and that's great to know if there's more of them on a bank in that area. I'd have to go back and visit it. I don't know why there wouldn't be more tree swallows other than maybe a lack of cavities in open areas. There's lots of woodpeckers in white mud, but I would, a lot of them are going to be in fairly forested situations that tree swallows prefer more in the open. It might be an interesting experiment if Wayne or someone with a better carpentry hand than me built a few boxes and put them on trees overhanging the creek and see if tree swallows occupy them.
If I may venture one more question.
Sure, go ahead, Jan.
Have you ever looked at recruitment of your local tree swallows? So do you ban the chicks before fledging and see if any of those come back?
We haven't done a detailed study, no. We did one on purple martins, and that's a whole extra story. But we do ban the chicks, but we have not tried to retrap them to look at the age structure or done a more detailed study of their dispersal. One way to do that would be using the MODIS system, so putting tags on and then seeing where the birds come back the following year. The reason we haven't tried that, we want to do it with purple martins first, is we need more MODIS stations, more MODIS towers to pick up birds away from Beaverhill, so we know if they're coming back somewhere else, we can find them. A lot of studies of birds, and this is a bone of contention on burring owls. If any of you have seen my burring owl talk, the assumption is if they don't come back, they must be dead. And that's clearly not the case. Birds can disperse and nest somewhere else. But no, I have not studied that in the tree swallows. I see there's a question here for you, Jan. What are the times for the birding 101 walks? Or maybe that's for Wayne.
I put the times in there in the chat, so.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see underneath. Thank you.
And the Nature Club calendar will have that in there too.
Right. Oh, I see. Yeah, you typed it lower down.
No other questions, I guess?
So, well, there's one here.
Or I missed something.
Ivermectin on cow pies is Kevin Foote with an extra E on FOTE, if I remember correctly, is with Agriculture Canada in Lethbridge. I haven't checked recently to see if he retired, but I don't think so.
Anybody have any other questions? Just unmute yourself. You don't have to put it in the chat. Nope, maybe not. A Go Oilers comment though.
I was just going to say that myself before we sign off. Oh, and
Sounds like that's it.
It wasn't even Gerald saying that. I thought for sure Gerald would be.
So it sounds like that's it for the questions and stuff. So
Great.
yeah, so that's it for this year's session, everybody. So thanks for coming out, and I hope you enjoyed everything. We had a lot of really good sessions. I'm just going to quickly see if I can share my
Thank you, Geoff.
PowerPoint here.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Colleen. Thank you, everyone, for attending. It's always fun. But I
Yeah.
do miss the in-person chat afterwards, but what can we do?
So
Yeah.
we had a lot of, I think I got
me
the,
too.
oh, I can't show what I was hoping to show, but anyways. We did have a lot of good presentations this year, and we've
Mhm.
got a few lined up for next year, but I don't have a full roster yet. So if anybody knows anybody that wants to do a presentation or has a topic of interest, let me know. You communicate through the website there. There's a contact button, and we'll try to get another great year going forward. So
Well,
thanks for coming.
I might mention, Karen, I know that I've been a regular speaker. At
Yes.
the Edmonton Lifelong Learners had me give a series in January, and I was able to come up with 10 different topics. So I'm not quite sure which topics I've talked to the Nature Club about, but I'm sure I've got more talks to go. And this is actually talk number 22 since the middle of January that I've given.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy winter for doing that.
That's great. We do appreciate it, Geoff. It's been excellent.
And it's fun
Yeah,
to do.
interesting.
Yep. So yes, we're hoping for more coming up. And like I said, if you have even something of interest that you'd like to find a topic for somebody to speak on, let me know as well. And then I can try and see if I can find somebody too. So that's it for us. And, keep looking back at the calendar for all the different walks and things coming up. There's quite a few events coming out. And if not, we'll see you back in the bird study group in the fall. So have a great summer and spring and bird on, people. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.